Good evening and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're listening from and whatever time you're listening to this video. We want to welcome you to another episode of Pages to Progress. We have commenced a brand new book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. I don't know if you can see that well, but there's the book. You can join with us on this journey. Jumping onto Amazon. We'll leave the link in the bottom of this video so that you can be able to find the book. We are going to be looking at chapter 1 of this book and reflecting our thoughts to it. Scazzero is a pastor, not an Adventist pastor, a pastor that has had some numerous successes here and there. His influence has really gone across the whole evangelical church movement. But I guess here is a platform or a place for us to be able to not just reflect, but possibly even critique with our own responses as we come to this. We don't read these books simply because we just want to jump on board and smile and nod at everything that is said, but we do read these books because we recognize that there might be some nuggets that we can gain for it, and maybe our interaction with them could bring up some new and interesting light. So I want to welcome you to the journey, those of you who are listeners. I am joined with my trusty panelists here. I have Joe, I have John, I have Dee. Thank you for sticking with me on the journey for the various different books that come our way. So we're going to kick off with a review, a little bit of a reflection on chapter 1. The title of the book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I'm going to start off by asking just a question, and maybe that can guide us into some of the reflections of this book. I'm wondering, for any of you, have you ever, in your walk in Christianity, ever had any indicators that measure your emotional health, emotionally healthy spirituality, or the health of your emotional spirituality? Have you ever had any indicators that measure that in your life? That's the question I'll start off with. Does anyone want to kick off with that? Yeah.
I think for me, when I get into kind of a rut with what I'm doing spiritually, that's kind of when I realize it's not meant to be something you just check things off the list and go day by day with. It needs to be more than that, and that's when I need to start backing up and taking a look at what I'm doing and changing things.
Okay. All right. I hear that. Anyone else want to share? Have you ever measured your emotional, spiritual health?
I don't know if I measured per se, but you can't help but look inward and work through the things that's going on inside you. That is, as he calls it, emotional aspect of who you are. You know, it's not just the feelings, but all the thoughts, experiences that come with those feelings. And, you know, you are a person first before you're a Christian. And you and that doesn't go away. I mean, you're not you don't like all of a sudden become a separate two different people. So it only makes sense that if there's going to be connection, that has to, I mean, as the book reads, has to be some way to bring those two together.
Right.
So my take, to answer the question, is there a checklist or a measure that kind of, I guess, begs the question, is there a list somewhere that you can ask these 10 questions and say, oh, you are 90% healthy, or you are 10% healthy emotionally and spiritually? Maybe you're a percentage of both. I mean, in the medical world, we do have a patient that comes in, and we have what's called a PHQ-9. It's a survey. It's a measure. So it's a screening tool that we have.
Use it all the time. Yep.
And here's 10 questions. If you answer,
the patient assesses the practitioner.
No,
Patient.
I see.
So we ask these 10 questions and objectively say, oh, if you answered, so in such a way that we can say, oh, it looks like you're depressed. And then we then engage a discussion and open dialogue about, hey, do you have things that we don't talk about? And there's one for ADD, there's ADHD, there's a series of questions. And I guess in the spiritual realm, there may be such a question, maybe Pastor, you would know, right? There's an inventory, right? And you talked about this over the weekend, the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and when they come in to be treated, there's this checklist perhaps, or they have to do their own inventory.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there is one, but I don't know of one in the spiritual emotional world.
That's really interesting, Joe. I never knew that, but it definitely highlights a few things. And to answer your question back to me, Joe, I can't say that I know of one holistically. I'll say that I grew up in a church upon which we were encouraged from a very young age to do certain things in order to gain a greater biblical understanding of who God was. And that involved things like memorizing Bible texts. I remember growing up and having my 13th Sabbaths where we would go up and we would share all the 13 memory verses that we had learned throughout the quarter. And it was this big thing, and etc. And the idea of knowing our Bible very well. We, as Seventh-day Adventists, are actually known across basically all of Christianity as being a denomination that has a very high biblical literacy. The average 15-year-old in the Adventist church, apparently, according to a Barna study in 2015, knows more than the average 50-year-old across the board of a number of different evangelical churches. And that's not to knock different evangelical churches. It's to say that there is a high emphasis on biblical knowledge within the Seventh-day Adventist church. But to talk about emotional spiritual health, not sure. Not sure if I was guided to really make any kind of assessment towards my mental emotional health as it interacts with my spirituality. I don't know if anyone has any further comments, but in this first chapter, Peter Scazzero, if I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, kind of lists 10-ish indicators that guide individuals to a better understanding of where they fit on an emotional healthy spiritual scale, if you were, or at least some indicators to try and show you these should send up some red flags for you. I don't have to necessarily go through all 10. I'll read all 10, but I will ask you guys if there was any of those in particular that spoke to you as you read this particular chapter that kind of jumped out to you. Here are the 10 indicators. He says on page 22, in short order, here are the top 10 symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. I'll just read them, and then we can just pick out some of the stuff that kind of spoke to us. Number 1, using God to run from God. Number 2, ignoring anger, sadness, and fear. Number 3, dying to the wrong things. Number 4, denying the impact of the past on the present. Number 5, dividing life into secular and sacred compartments. Number 6, doing for God instead of being with God. Number 7, spiritualizing away conflicts. Number 8, covering our brokenness, weakness, and failure. Number 9, living without limits. And number 10, judging other people's spiritual journey. Let me be quiet from there and open the floor. So what are you guys' thoughts? Did anything jump out for you in this chapter that's worth discussing for you?
Yeah, so he breaks down each one of those 10 things. And so what I decided, I'd use a plus minus system on all of that with a 0 if it was indifferent on it.
Gosh, I know that I'm speaking to medical professionals, man. Anyway, carry on.
Well, and so, yeah, I'm a surgeon in the medical profession. And so it's not surprising that one of the things I felt I struggle with is number 6, doing for God instead of being with God.
Okay.
I'm very much a doer. part of what I do for a living. So that's one of the things. And then the other one that jumped out at me was denying the impact of the past on the present. And I think, I'm always looking forward more than I'm looking back, and there's some value in looking back.
Mm-hmm.
And
may I ask you for the second one, denying the impact on the past and the present, and I hope it's not a too obvious, Captain Obvious question, but why do you think it's something you struggle with?
Well, so it's something I struggle with because my dad was an only son.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of just missed the baby boomer by not too much, and then became a doctor and was just fawned over by his parents, and very much was a dominant personality in the family. My mom was the one that was working behind the scenes, keeping things going, but my dad was the one making the calls. And I think, that not only affected me professionally to some degree, but also spiritually. He was the one who decided where we were going to go to church, when, and, what he was going to be involved with and stuff like that.
Yeah, I hear that. That definitely resonated with me. You mentioned specifically, what was the first one again? Doing for God, number 6.
Doing for God instead of being with God.
Yeah, I highlighted something on number 6, which I thought was worth repeating. On page 31, he says, but work for God is not nourished by a deep he talks a lot about the areas that you can sometimes do for God instead of being with God. And he says, but work for God that is not nourished by a deep interior life with God will eventually be contaminated by other things, such as ego, power, needing approval of and from others, and buying into the wrong ideas of success and the mistaken belief that we can't fail. To me, I totally related with this 100%. I don't have a good relationship with healthy failure in my life. I don't. I've always had the extra pressure lorded over me. I mean, maybe it's because I have firstborn syndrome, where the pressure is always there for me to lay the path for others to come. And so when failure does happen, I tend to crumble. Without healthily, I'm going to now connect my spirituality to that, healthily understand, where does Jesus fit into the relationship with me and failure? What does that actually look like in me processing and growing from failure? We could come up with several biblical examples where people have failed and God has used them in their failure. Anyone else who would like to share either from those 10 things that resonated with them or something in the chapter that really struck a chord?
Oh gosh, Oh yeah.
Sounds like you wrestled.
No, it's not about wrestle. It was more about since I was a child, I've always been told, you're too sensitive, you feel too much, that kind of stuff along, you know what I mean? I've always been told that, but I've always felt like I've been able to really be able to understand the emotional part of myself, how all of my emotions interact with my mental, my physical, just relationships, just everything. And certainly reading through this list, I get it. I definitely, I have to say, I've been guilty of some of this stuff, but I've been able to work through them. So to be quite honest, like today, when I look at this list, I don't struggle with any of this list here.
None?
And maybe if we dive more into it, when I say I don't, did I just say I don't struggle with it? Yeah, I don't struggle with it. I mean, definitely depends on what happens in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Like I struggle with trying to gather my emotions and be able to express it in a way that's healthy,
Mm-hmm.
Especially for my family members, so that I don't influence them in any negative way. But I know that in my relationship with God, I worked through a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've been so aware of existing of those things in my life, and like today, I in all honesty, I don't really, like I said, I don't really struggle with any of this stuff.
That's okay.
Doesn't mean that it don't pop up.
Mm-hmm.
It pops up, but I'm able to work through it again quickly. You know what I mean?
Okay. Maybe you've done
that makes sense.
That makes sense. Maybe you've done a lot of work on some of this stuff.
I have done a lot of work.
I know I can speak very plainly and say that I'm a strong believer of therapy. I've been in therapy for the longest while, not necessarily because I have problems, but because I have problems. That's the simple core and truth of it. And that's one of those things where I believe that I'm kind of in therapy for life, because to me there are constant things that I am always working with, and some people are further along the journey than others. And as you said, Dee, some of those things might pop out for you. Certainly for me, there was a few other things that popped out.
That's kind of, this is only the first chapter, but one of the problems I have with this book is he is very much coming from his own experience with being emotionally unhealthy, to the point where he and his wife were having problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book is very much about, becoming emotionally healthy and using his experience and then developing a program. But he does mention, these 5 things, different parts of who we are on page 20. He literally has a pie chart.
Mm-hmm.
And the emotional part is highlighted, but there's also social, intellectual, spiritual, and physical. And so my thought was, well, you want to have a good balance of being healthy with all of those, because they all can potentially affect your spirituality. But obviously this book is focused more on the emotional part and not any of the other 4. And so that kind of leaves me wondering, are we going to be too focused on one thing and to the detriment of the others, or not? And I don't know, it's a journey, and we'll find out, I guess.
That's interesting that you say that. I don't want to take too much of the light, because I know Joe hasn't spoken yet, but I will say this just before, maybe if Joe, you want to chime in. On that pie chart on page 20, I struggled with processing that pie chart. And like I said, we have to walk because we're still going through the book of Moroni chapter 1. But my immediate reaction was my entire life is really part of a spiritual dynamic, not a section of it. My spiritual life interacts with my emotional, my social, intellectual, and even my physical aspect of who I am. But so to coordinate off as something separate, I immediately feel, I'm not totally with him as of yet. And we've yet to find out where that goes. But the elements of emotional unhealthiness that he details are things that I certainly resonate with. Joe, did you have any other reflections you wanted to add?
Sure. Of those 10, that list, I could say I've been there. I'm working on a few, and maybe still I have others to work on. I definitely know that it's a work in progress that God has in my life. I had a lot of emotional incidences in my life. It goes all the way back from marriages, and I could kind of relate to him as well, and some struggles maritally, and then you wonder how even your struggles with the children. but I came from a very good and very solid background. He talks about generational issues, your past, your parents' relationship with you and how that affects you going forward. I think I had a really good one. It was my own personal, I think, issues that I had to deal with. But there was a couple of issues that I did have issues with as I was going through. I kind of saw that, he was laying out the groundwork for his book, at least the title says it, emotionally, healthy spirituality, kind of the need for emotional health and spiritual health. And of course, in that list of 4, I think it's in page 27, kind of, I was kind of drawn to this one paragraph. Not that I completely agree with this, but
I think Joe has different page number because he's got a digital book. Just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, right. Yeah, so maybe it says page 27 of 240. I think it might be the same. It says under the category of the 4th question at the very last paragraph, it says the work of growing in Christ, what the theologians call sanctification, does not mean that we don't go back to the past as we press ahead to what God has for us. It actually demands we go back in order to break free from unhealthy and destructive patterns that prevent us from loving ourselves and others as God designed. Now, that paragraph seems nice. It seems okay. But when I went and dug deeper, I'm like, well, I don't know, I agree with that 100%, because I think the question is, we have a justification, which is, your kind of born again experience, and then sanctification is going forward. His question is, before you go forward, it demands that you go back and look at your past. And that's what he failed to do, I guess, in his own life, right? He didn't address his family dysfunction, his marital dysfunction, how he brought all those bad habits into his current marriage and family. And he says, and he couldn't have a really great spiritual life until he went back. And so this one, he says, and I think this is where I think he's laying the groundwork, and he gives a question, he gives a problem. You're right, John. He gives his own personal experiences, and then at the end of this chapter, he gives an offer, a solution, and he invites us to go on this journey with him. And hopefully we'll get to that at the end of this, further in this discussion. But he says we got to stop. We got to address that problem that we have, that we all have. He says. And we need to do it somehow. And then he offers a solution, which we'll talk about here shortly.
Yeah, are you saying, Joe, that what you are describing as sanctification? Now, let me start with maybe a helpful definition. I'll give my definition of what I see sanctification as. So to me, sanctification, I would define, is the process upon which the real image of God is fully manifested in an individual over time. That's my definition that I would say of what takes place. Now, you may differ with that definition, that's fine. Are you saying that sanctification, as you understand it, is really only concerned with going forward? Is that what you are saying?
No, what I thought I was paraphrasing what he says. The work of growing in Christ, in parentheses, says what theologians call sanctification. Doesn't mean that we don't go back. So what he is saying is that the conventional, maybe evangelicals, and maybe myself, the process of once you're justified, you have that born again experience, you kind of go forward and that daily work with God.
Sure.
But the growing in Christ is what he's defining as sanctification.
And are you disagreeing that with him saying it demands you go back so that you can go forward?
Right. What I'm saying is that I think that I'm just saying that I am trying to understand where he's going with his book. And I think that he is laying out the groundwork, saying, hey, we all have emotional baggage, whether we realize it or not. In fact, if you don't know, go through these checklists and you'll quickly realize that we all have it, and whether we admit it or not. And then he says, if we finally recognize and admit that we have problems hidden in small as it be, some of us have more. Darlene, you recognize you've overcome few. He says it demands that we go back and break free of these chains. And he's thinking that we are bound by these chains of our past that prevent us from fully experiencing Christ in the future, is what I read from that paragraph.
I'm with you.
Can I just clarify my
Go for it.
statement?
Oh, sure.
I mean, I am not saying that I am like emotionally perfect. Okay, not at all in any sense of the word. But this
Dee, you'll be starting
experience,
your class very soon, teaching us all how to.
No. It's just that in my own experience, it's just that God has worked with me. I think it was a simultaneous kind of work.
Okay.
Looking at the past, looking to the future, and being in the present. All of that working together. So in order for me to go forward in my present time right now, there are things that come up. In order for me to go forward, I needed to go backward and work through that. But that's all happening all really at the same time.
Right.
And really, I've always said, God is the greatest therapist, and He's been my therapist. And I work things. Yeah. Not in any way saying I am emotionally like.
I totally agree with Darlene. I didn't mean to say that you were perfect.
No, I just want you guys to understand. And I'm
that's cool.
I'm not claiming anything really like that.
That's fine. I'm gonna make I won't make the assumption. Actually, I'll ask that. I think everyone here came from a healthy enough family to suggest you had both mother and father, and it stayed that way. There wasn't divorce or anything. Is that correct or not correct? Is it the same with you, Joe?
Yeah, my parents are stayed together.
All right. So I responded to this book very differently as a child of divorce. And I am still working through some of that stuff. I would even suggest maybe I'm on the opposite end of D, probably because of my age, that I am working through a lot of this stuff, even as now, because those are that's the context upon which my spirituality has been placed into. So I'll give you guys a fundamental example of how I struggled over the years to understand this. And this is by no means any disrespect to my own father, but due to circumstances, my father wasn't as present as I think he could have been. Now, as a result of that, my concept of understanding God as a father has been very difficult for me over the years. The understanding that he is in fact a father has been something that I've continued to try and grow with. I think I'm getting a little bit better, but depending on the kind of father that I believe God is, colors the rest of my theology. And that's something that situates my spirituality. And the only way that can be solved is if I am, as Scazzero says, allow the demands of the trajectory to go back into my past, work through that, and recognize that Jesus actually not just fills in the hole, but actually creates a whole new picture upon which that I can identify with. I hope I was making sense.
I can completely identify with that, and I can tell you my story with that exact same thing. In my spiritual walk, I could not imagine God as Father. I had a very difficult time. I could not verbalize Him being a father. And I have a great dad, but there are a couple of things that happened in my life with him that really caused a lot of pain. And as I was going through my spiritual walk, I knew in my heart, not having that resolved with my dad was causing me to not be able to look at God as Father. So whenever there's a Bible verse in the Bible that says, referring to Father, or the pastor talks about Him being a father, I literally just like turned it off. I couldn't go there. And I knew that was keeping me from being able to have a deeper relationship with God. So I basically prayed about it. I prayed that I be able to forgive my dad. And as I was praying for several months, out of the blue, my dad called me one day. It was just completely out of the blue. And he began talking about the event that happened that caused me a lot, that left him with me a lot of pain. And he actually apologized. I mean, I never approached him about it, but through the prayer, obviously Holy Spirit was working in his heart. And he apologized and recognized what he did. And since then, that made me be able to forgive him and let go of that pain, and really be able to look at God as my Father. And I feel completely safe, completely great now looking at God as the father figure.
Right.
You know,
right,
so
right.
I completely understand what you mean by that.
Yeah. So
yeah.
So I think that what Scazzero is highlighting for us and is there are aspects of our hidden self which need ample work for us to gain a full and holistic picture of the God in our lives that needs to be revealed and understood. One of the things that definitely was huge for me in this chapter was this, I'm probably saying the same, or the spiritualizing away conflict, which was massive for me. This is something that I'm, in a sense, still trying to juggle through. But it was something that really just I resonated with a lot, because for a lot of aspects of my life, when I do get into conflict, the idea of spiritualizing conflict is essentially saying stuff like, well, God has brought me here, so therefore there's a reason why I need to be here. I don't actually disagree with that theology. I don't at all. The spiritualizing of conflict, however, goes to the nth degree of totally ignoring that conflict and just hoping that I can just move on because apparently God has dealt with it. When in fact, and I think this is a biblical call, which he quotes Psalms 51 and verse 17, saying, "My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart to you. God will not despise." Many a times my sacrifice to God isn't my broken spirit, if that makes any sense. Many a times my sacrifice to God will be a spirit where I just want to hide the things that I don't want to really talk about or deal with, and just focus on the things that I'm doing pretty okay with. And the thing is, I was taught that from my background in my church when I was young. And now it's kind of woken me up to the realization of, instead of escaping away from the problems that really on the undercurrent of my life, God is inviting me to deal with them with me. To use Dee's words, he is my therapist in that respect, and he asks me to go into that. These are some of the things that really resonated with me. I'm wondering, ladies and gents, is there anything else from this chapter that struck out for you as interesting, or something that you possibly also disagreed with that you are still waiting on to see how it develops?
Nothing for me. I'm looking forward to getting into some of these different areas.
Okay. All right. I'll towards the end, as he introduces us to go into the new chapters that we move forward, he's inviting us into the journey of trying to unearth not just an emotionally unhealthy, but I suppose what looks like an emotionally healthy spirituality. I'm still on the fence when it comes to him creating a totally separate spiritual kind of pie in the pie chart, but we'll see what that essentially looks like. I'm going to read just at the end on page 36 in my book, a section right at the end. He says he's talking a little bit about the idea of learning to be yourselves, but he says this: by failing to let others be themselves before God and move at their own pace, we inevitably project onto them our own discomfort with their choice to live life differently than we do. We end up eliminating them in our minds, trying to make others like us, abandoning them altogether, and falling into who cares indifference towards them. In some way, the silence of unconcern can be more deadly than hate. Now, I say that within the context of his final assessment, which was judging other people's spirituality, something that I have still struggled with even up until now. Anybody who has different theology to mine is obviously going to be wrong in my eyes, where Jesus is essentially going to try and humble me and make me work. Hang on a minute, Sam. Everyone actually has a validated journey with me, Sam, and you need to allow them to have that process. I'm reminded of the story of the prodigal son, where I was always uncomfortable with a father who allows that younger son to go off to squander everything he has and do whatever he has to do. And I'm not a father, but I can imagine the difficulty What if one of your children came to me and was vocal with letting you know, I'm just going to go and do whatever I want to do. By the way, can you fund it? Can I take your credit card with me? And I don't think we need to spend a lot of time as to what I think you would do. But the reality is, the prodigal son paints an uncomfortable picture for me of a God who says, fine, if you want to go do what you want to do, go do what you want to do. I'm going to give you the space to be able to grow. I'm uncomfortable with that kind of God, because I'd rather him rein me in and keep me close, so that I don't actually make the mistakes that I make mistakes. But I think that what Scazzero is trying to get across is to be honest and real and authentic with our true selves, so that we can be open enough to grow as we grow in our own spirituality. That's my assessment of where we're at right now and where we're going. Any final thoughts, or can we wrap up?
I'd like my thoughts as well.
Go for it.
For us to transition to this side, I would tend to a little bit disagree with that assessment as well, and I hope you allow me to disagree.
Yeah,
with
go
that.
for it.
When I finally came to this last paragraph, and my paragraph is, again, it's paragraph 36. In fact, it's the very last two paragraphs of this chapter, when he offers his revolutionary antidote.
Okay.
And when it means revolutionary, he kind of brings this as a, a total 180-degree, experience for him, and that's his revolutionary change in his life. And he presents to us, his experience and how he would like to share his experience with us and help us go along with his journey. And it says here, the pathway to unleashing the transformative power of Jesus to heal our spiritual lives is found in the joining of emotional health and the contemplative spirituality. And then he refers us to Appendix B for a definition of the emotional health and contemplative spirituality, that we need both. Now, then he says, let me invite you to come with me on this exciting journey of the pathway. When it finally got to this section, it didn't settle well with me, if I have to be honest with you. And the reason is, as I was looking at that paragraph, what worked for him may not necessarily work for me or you. But in this particular way, he's really hoping that, that we invoke or have this same sort of revolutionary kind of experience, and we do that through this kind of delving into our emotional dishealth or unhealthiness, right? That's the first paragraph, right? And then he wants to integrate this the contemplative spirituality. And to me, that word contemplative spirituality, it has a dissonance with me, if you don't mind me sharing, because to me that has a very it's kind of maybe a, what's the word? It kind of invokes a lot of thoughts of maybe the mysticism, mystic, the monastic mystic,
the Neo movement.
The neo-Buddhist, yes, mysticism, and the old maybe Jesuit philosophies and Catholicism, and going into further kind of that, when I looked into some of the appendix that he asked us to look at, was a little bit surprised that it actually was very, very forthright in saying, hey, this is my way of digging into my emotional side, is using this contemplative spirituality. Silence and prayers and those things, and I'd like to maybe bring about a conversation maybe another time if we don't have time today, but why it kind of was unsettling to me a little bit, because to me, look at all the references. There was a lot of references to the monastic mystics and Catholic teachings, and
okay. If I might then, I don't know if you guys managed to look at Appendix B. Okay, well, I'll do maybe just a quick summary of what Joe's talking about as well, because I thought it was quite interesting as well. I'm going to read very quickly what he says about contemplative, as his definition of contemplative spirituality on page 212, Appendix B. Contemplative spirituality, on the other hand, is concerned with slowing down to be with God, focusing on such practices as, and I'm not going to read all of them, I'll just pick a few here and there. Awakening and surrendering to God's love in any and every situation, positioning ourselves to hear God and remembering his presence in all we do. A few others: practice in silence, solitude, and a life of unceasing prayer, resting attentively in the presence of God. A few others: developing a balanced, harmonious rhythm of life that enables us to be aware of the sacred all in all life. So anyway, I'll leave you guys to read again, and our listeners to read again as we dive into that. I think Joe, there's a lot of value in what you have to say there. I think that especially when we come with words associated to these neo movements, because let's just be frank, a lot of these words are associated with neo movements, because some of these definitions do come from, or at least the words that are used do come from there. I'm certainly going to be trying my best to be open-minded, to recognize that his definitions may not follow suit with the exact definitions of others, and see where it goes and where he takes us. As I walked through the definitions of his contemplative spirituality, at the moment I see everything points back to God, is what I can see, everything. And I'm keen to find out where he takes us in that level, because I recognize there are some aspects which are actually unhealthy to a Christian practice. I'll name one. At the emptying of one's mind, where you completely have nothing inside of it, is something I'm not a fan of, I'm not in support of. If that is what Scazzero is suggesting, then I certainly won't be jumping on the bandwagon, but I'm not seeing the evidence of that yet. That's just one aspect. There may be others here and there. I think what I see at the moment is Scazzero is inviting us to try and adopt practices that get us closer to the God that embraces our emotional health. That's what I would say, and that's my response. What I think is what is going on. But it's chapter 1. It's chapter 1. So it's difficult to really totally say. I'm sure we're going to have more to say on this as we get to chapter 2, 3, and beyond. That's my response. Does anyone else want to chime in or say anything? But that's what I think at the moment. So I recognize, Joe, your cautious tread. I do, and I think you arrest our attention to possibly even do the same as well as we go through the chapters. And I welcome you, listeners online, to come and tread cautiously with us as we go through this book, as we grow together. I think one thing is for sure is the prayer that the Holy Spirit can guide us through these pages to see not necessarily Scazzero, not even necessarily us as the forefront of everything, but as God, as a loving Savior who can walk us through every single aspect of our life, namely our emotional health. So we want to thank you, those who are watching online, joining us from wherever you are. You're listening to another episode of Pages to Progress. We've been going through the book by Peter Scazzero, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. There's a link below where you can find the Amazon link to the book. Join us on the journey. We would love to hear your thoughts. But until next week, we wish you well. We'll be diving into chapter 2 of this book for some more conversation and reflection. May God bless you. Take care. Bye.